All right, we're going to barrel along with letters and meetings and notes. Oh my. So the first thing that we get is a letter to a man by the name of Jared Carter, or I'm sorry, John Carter. Jared Carter, somebody else. So a letter to John S. Carter. It is written with Joseph Smith's own hand, but this is from a letter book. This is not like an original letter. And it has some things in there about authority and so forth. And so I wanted to get into this because it winds up that John S. Carter has kind of an interesting life. So we're going to start with the historical introduction from Volume 3. And it says, in 1797, several members of Carter's family established the Baptist Church of Benson. John was elected to be a pastor for that church in 1822. And he served in that role until a group of Baptist ministers from the area decided that his teachings were not in harmony with Baptist orthodoxy. Carter left his post and led a congregation of Free Will Baptists in Benson. In late October 1831, John's younger brother Jared, who had been baptized into the Church of Christ, which is now the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, earlier that year, arrived in Benson while serving a proselyting mission. While John was preaching in another town, Jared baptized 27 people in Benson, including virtually all of his brother's Free Will Baptist congregation. What a thing to come home to. So anyway, in November 1831, Jared introduced John to Joseph Smith's teachings. John was baptized into the Church of Christ sometime before January 15, 1832, when Jared left to return to Kirtland, Ohio. What a thing to come home to. I'm going to go on a mission when I come back. All my congregation is converted to an entirely different religion, but I guess he took it well. Further into the introduction, in his letter, Carter also apparently sought further knowledge about the gathering to Zion, a topic he had heard discussed at a church conference in Benson held on the 10th of August in 1832. On the 6th of March, 1833, Carter wrote in his journal that some church members in Vermont came to him, quote, to inquire the way to Zion. Later in the month, he described the desire of Benson converts to travel to Kirtland and thence to Missouri, but he was unsure how to properly offer them assistance. He stated that some had already made their calculation to go up to Zion, though their way appears hedged up. So he's writing this letter to Joseph Smith saying, we've got a lot of people up here. They want to come and join with the Saints, Kirtland, Missouri, whatever. How do we do this? Like, what do we do here? And so he writes this letter that we don't have, but the aftermath of the letter and a little bit about the life of Brother Carter here is in the historical introduction. So we get this. After receiving this letter, and apparently the second letter mentioned above from Joseph Smith, Carter made the immigration of New England Mormons to Ohio and Missouri a priority. On the 16th of May, 1833, in a letter published in the Evening and the Morning Star, Sylvester Smith wrote, quote, I have received a letter from Brother John informing me that the church in Benson, Vermont was going up to Zion this summer. In late August 1833, Carter organized the departure of the church members from Benson to Ohio and Missouri. He began his journey to Kirtland on the 5th of September and effectively closed the branch of the church in Benson with his departure. He arrived in Kirtland sometime after the 27th of September and was among the 12 men chosen to serve in the church's first standing high council, organized by Joseph Smith in Kirtland on the 17th of February, 1834. So in English, this means basically a stake high council is what we would call it. He was one of the first. Carter later traveled in the camp of Israel, later known as Zion's Camp, and died of cholera in Clay County, Missouri, on the 24th of June, 1834. Kind of a sad ending. But what an amazing thing. So he goes off, preaches as part of his Free Will congregation because he didn't feel right about, I guess, what the Baptists were doing in his area. So he starts his own thing, was proselyting, came back. They're all converted to the church. And he winds up joining and basically running his branch yet again. So I don't know what you would call yourselves, like, well, we just kind of shifted our beliefs, but it's a lot of the same people, and then they wound up coming to Zion. And what's really great about this is there's a lot of really wonderful, very modern teachings, something that we very much teach today that Joseph Smith gives in this. So anyway, a very interesting letter that we're about to read, and a very sad ending to Brother Carter's life. So some highlights from this, some footnotes. This is what Joseph writes in response. And like I said, what's interesting is that Joseph's writing in his own hand in the letter book, but this is not the letter that was sent, just a copy. So it says this: "We proceed to answer your questions, first concerning your labor in the region where you live. We acquiesce in your feelings on this subject until the mouth of the Lord shall name. And as it respects the vision you speak of, we do not consider ourselves bound to receive any revelation from any one man or woman without being legally constituted and ordained to that authority and given sufficient proof of it. I will inform you that it is contrary to the economy of God for any member of the church or any one to receive instruction for those in authority higher than themselves. Therefore, you will see the impropriety of giving heed to them." And this is a big teaching of the church today. And it's also notable, I think, that at this time, he said men or women. So the idea was that, yes, women are going to receive revelations, but the way that there's a big teaching in the church is that you do have a sphere of influence. And so if you're a deacon's quorum president and you're 12 years old and you have a revelation for your quorum, great. But if you're a teacher in the teacher's quorum, you can't exactly be telling the bishop or the Relief Society president or the primary president what to do. So there's an order to things. And this is sort of the order of the house of God idea. So very interesting that this was given even way back then. But there was a vision given of hey, I feel like we should come, and this is the vision that we have. And I love that Joseph's like, dude, that sounds great, but just so you know, we're not under any obligation to that, but you do you, which I think is, again, very open-minded for the 1800s. So continuing on in this revelation for oneself, the letter says, "But if any have a vision, heavenly, or a visitation from an heavenly messenger, it must be for their own benefit and instruction, for the fundamental principles, government, and doctrine of the church is invested in the keys of the kingdom." There you go. So how do you handle tough situations with members was another question here. It says in the letter, "And again, the proper way of laboring with a member, we are to deal with them precisely as the scriptures direct. If thy brother trespass against thee, take him between him and thee alone. Keep it private." Again, something we very much do today. In fact, I think bishops' offices are soundproof. They really want to make sure that if it's private, it stays that way. And then, of course, there's the question of how to move to Zion. And this is kind of also where Joseph's handwriting ends, as you can see here. But it says, "With respect to preparing to go to Zion first, it would be pleasing to the Lord that the church or churches going to Zion should be organized and appointed a suitable person who is well acquainted with the conditions of the church, and be sent to Kirtland to inform the bishop and procure license from him, agreeable to the revelations. So doing, you will prevent confusion and disorder and escape many difficulties that attend an unorganized band in journeying into the last days. And again, those in debt should in all cases pay their debts, and the rich are in no wise to cast out the poor or leave them behind." So basically clear yourself of whatever the heck you're doing. Come to the bishop. He's going to issue you a license. Take care of yourself. Do what you got to do, right? So that's, I thought, very interesting. So footnote 22 for this says something very interesting about postage and paying it, and I've heard of this before. It says, "Having to pay postage for incoming letters continued to be a problem for Joseph Smith. 2 years later, he felt compelled to publish a similar request in the church's newspaper. Quote, 'I wish to inform my friends and all others abroad that whenever they wish to address me through the post office, they will be kind enough to pay the postage on the same.'" Unquote. English, what does this mean? Well, today in the United States, when you mail a letter, you put a stamp on it first. You have to pay for your postage before you throw it in that mailbox. And that stamp indicates to the post office that you paid for this letter to be sent, right? They use it like money. Well, in days past, you used to be able to send a letter, and then the postman would hold out his hand and be like, "You have to pay for the postage of that." So everybody was just sending Joseph letters all day long, and he had to spend all this money paying the postage for somebody else's stuff. They just don't even do that anymore today. The sender pays the postage, just like Joseph was asking for. So he did not change how the post office works, by the way, but it's just him saying, "Please stop doing this." You're charged, I'm getting charged a ton of money for this. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. The next thing we get is a letter to church leaders in Missouri. So this is kind of a form of synchronizing with those leaders in responding to items in their letters. So they would send letters about stuff, And they would use the language of epistles. And I believe they did that to follow the pattern of the New Testament. And so this like, hey, a general epistle to the saints in Kirtland. They were trying to mimic and emulate probably those that way of writing and receiving letters back then. They here again, this is the response to that. So the Kirtland Saints with Joseph Smith sending a letter to the Missouri Saints. They insert once again the revelation that Frederick is now in the United Order. Frederick G. Williams is now in the United Order. So again, section 90. And then we get to the part about what Sidney Gilbert wrote. So Sidney has been writing some nasty stuff about Joseph and so forth. And so this is what we get from the letter. With respect to Brother Sidney Gilbert's letter on the 10th of December, I would say to him as follows. Firstly, we received the letter with this conviction that he wrote it in all sincerity of his heart, and were pleased with the style and composition, but upon mature reflection and inquiry at the hand of the Lord, we find some things that are unreconcilable, especially to some. I mean with respect to hints given that are not clearly explained, as every letter that comes from Zion must go the rounds of the brethren for inspection. It is necessary that there should be no disguise in them, but that every subject written from brethren should be plain to the understanding of all, that no jealousies may be raised. And when we rebuke, do it in all meekness. And the letter written on the 24th February was not written in that contrition of heart, which should have been, for it appeared to be written in too much of a spirit of justification. But the letter to Brother Whitney on the 20th of March was written to our entire satisfaction. Now I would say to Brother Gilbert that I do not write this by way of chastisement, but to show him the absolute necessity of having all his communications written plain. Now I find that interesting, that, we appreciate your letter. We don't feel like you were writing in a contrite heart, but you were trying to justify yourself. And I mean, talk about social media today. There's a lot of that going on. But apparently they tuned it up eventually. So I think it's great that there's a lot of like, look, and it says, it seems like you're really trying to be sincere, but just know there's got to be a pattern to this so we don't have problems. It also talks about how Sidney Redden has actually started a new branch on the mission that he was called on, and John Corll confessed to something and is now back in good standing. So, people coming together, things working out, synchronizing the churches together. Footnote 25 to all this says, John Corll was a counselor to Bishop Edward Partridge. Corll's confession may have been an apology for writing an accusatory letter to Joseph Smith in the summer of 1832. Though the letter has not survived, Joseph Smith described it as stirring up matters that he thought had been settled and forgiven, and said that it was made absolutely false charges, including allegations that Joseph Smith sought for monarchical power. In short, Joseph Smith wrote, I do not fellowship the letter which was written to me by Brother John, and neither the spirit thereof. An epistle sent from Kirtland to church leaders in Missouri in mid-January of 1833 also addressed Corll's charge that Joseph Smith had been, quote, seeking after monarchical power and authority, declaring that we are sensible that this is not the thing Brother J is seeking after. Bro J. That's maybe a nickname we can give Joseph Smith. The High Council instead declared that Joseph Smith was only trying to magnify the high office and calling whereunto he has been called and appointed by the commandment of God. Some fighting words, Bro J. And Bro J, actually, there's two Bro J's here. We got Brother John and Brother Joseph. So whichever Bro J you're on, but it seemed like they had a bit of a tiff. And, more or less he said, look, I'm sorry. Maybe I went too far with it, and Joseph forgave it. And that's something that I see a lot in these correspondences. And I know they were public, and so I think that was part of it. But, they kind of say, hey, thank you. You apologized. We're good, blah, 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 and move on, which was kind of fun to see. All right. So some content and footnotes from a conference of high priests. And this is kind of interesting. How do you run the church back then? How do you pay for stuff? So let's subscribe to a paper to pay for stuff. Quote from the content: a conference of high priests convened in the schoolroom. The meeting commenced with prayer by Brother Joseph. The council being organized in due form, Brother Joseph said that it was necessary that a subscription should be opened to procure money to pay for the use of the house that meetings were held in the past season. Accordingly, the conference appointed Brother Albert Brown to circulate a subscription paper for that purpose. Footnote 2 for this says, The house referred to here is likely the schoolhouse on, quote, the flats, which was often used for church meetings in Kurland. So they wanted to pay their bills properly. That's a good meeting. What I love about this is we get, I'll just read it from the Conference of High Priests. It says, next thing in question was the expediency of John P. Green going to Parkman and to take the charge of that branch of the church. It was decided that he should have letters of recommendation and an epistle to that church to take the oversight thereof as soon as it is convenient, move to that place. Footnote 3 for this says, William and Elizabeth Stones Jolly were reportedly the first Mormons to live in Parkman, Ohio. They moved from Fayette, New York to Parkman in late 1831. Elizabeth preached to Noah Packard and gave him a copy of the Book of Mormon, which led to the conversion of Noah and his wife, Sophia Bundy. In early June 1832, Solomon Humphrey was subsequently called to preach in the Parkman area, and Noah Packard in December of 1832. While this is unknown how many people had joined the church in Parkman by April 1833, the number was apparently sufficient to warrant appointing Green to oversee a branch there. According to his son, Green moved his family to Parkman to fulfill this appointment. And then the last portion of this is making sure that we take care of Vienna Jaques as she is moving to Zion. But I just wanted to point out that a very faithful woman, Elizabeth Stones Jolly, was the one who founded a branch. And this is no surprise. I mean, anybody can preach the gospel and anyone can hand out the Book of Mormon. And that led to an entire congregation that got so big, somebody had to move there to take care of that branch. And so I just found that really funny. So thank you, Elizabeth, for opening your mouth and teaching the gospel, which I think is fantastic. The next thing we get is a letter to Edward Partridge. So we're going to get into a little of this here. A lot of love here, a lot of good language here for Edward, or for Bishop Partridge. His efforts, the receiving a chastening, the honesty he's tried to show. And then Joseph Smith gets into an interesting thing here, and he explains consecration. He says this, and now I will proceed to tell you my views concerning consecration, property, and giving inheritance, etc. The law of the Lord binds you to receive whatsoever property is consecrated by deed. The consecrated property is considered the residue kept for the Lord's storehouse, and it is given for this consideration for to purchase inheritances for the poor. This any man has a right to do, agreeable to all laws of our country, to donate, give, or consecrate all that he feels disposed to give, and it is your duty to see that whatsoever is given legally. Therefore, it must be given for the consideration of the poor saints, and in this way, no man can take any advantage of you in the law. So footnote 10 from volume 3 says, after property was initially consecrated, the bishop was to appoint every man a steward over his own property, or that which he had received, in as much as shall be sufficient for himself and family, and the residue shall be kept to administer to him that hath not, that every man may receive according as he stands in need, and the residue shall be kept in my storehouse to administer to the poor and needy. Given the vague instructions that appear in previous revelations, it is unclear if Joseph Smith considered the stewardship as private or church property before this letter. Regarding consecrated property, the 20th of May, 1831 revelation, so this is years ago, specifically told Partridge that the steward was to, quote, hold it of the church. Such ambiguous phrases in the Revelations, such as his own property, not receive again, and hold it off in the church, might also explain why Partridge initially considered the inheritance to be property of the church. Footnote 11 for this also says, a week before Joseph Smith wrote this letter, news of a court case in which an individual sued Partridge over consecrated property was published in the northeastern Ohio area. So definitely, you're in trouble. Let's clarify this a little bit. But that was the idea, is that these were donated properties, consecrated back, deeded back, or not deeded back, but sort of gifted as an inheritance in Zion. And that way the rich more or less could retain what they needed for their families, and those who had without could actually get land, and everybody could be more or less made equal. Very interesting. So, what happens to people if they want to bail on the whole thing? Well, this letter explains that too. It says, in other words, to be his individual property, his private stewardship, and if he has found a transgressor and should be cut off out of the church, his inheritance is his still, and he is delivered over to the buffetings of Satan until the day of redemption. But the property which he consecrated to the poor for their benefit and inheritance and stewardship, he cannot obtain again by the law of the Lord. Thus you see the propriety of this law, that rich men cannot have power to disinherit the poor by obtaining again that which they have consecrated, which is the residue signified in the law. So you can't just say, hey, I consecrate all this stuff and I'm going to do my thing. Actually, I've changed my mind. I want all my property back. No, that property now belongs to somebody else. So a really good way not to pull the rug out from somebody else's foot. So very good. All right, then we get another meeting. This is the 2nd of May, 1833, where it was decided that several of the elders and a priest had illegal ordinations and that the churches should not receive them. Very interesting. So the historical introduction to this, I'm not going to get into it too much for sake of time, but it says, Rigdon may have thus deemed the ordinations of these 4 men invalid if he learned that the branch or branches to which the men belonged had not voted or were not given the opportunity to vote to authorize their ordinations. Perhaps he requested a license or proof of authority from the men that they could not provide. Whatever the case, immediately upon his return to Kirtland, Rigdon reported the results of the council proceedings to Joseph Smith and Frederick G. Williams, who affirmed the decision on the 2nd of May. So that's one of the reasons why these guys were more or less said, like, no, you're not valid. You have to be voted in. That has to be common consent. There's another meeting that we get on May the 4th. Be with you. Long before that. Anyway, in 1833, it says that Jared Carter wants to build a schoolhouse for the training of the elders before they're sent forth. And so let's do a paper subscription to go buy the stuff to make the schoolhouse. And so they wanted to build their own building for the School of the Prophets, which I think is a very noble thing to go after. All right, that's it for this part. Next part that we're going to get into is section 93 itself. A lot of doctrinal things, but hopefully all of the experiences that we're getting into at this time is sort of the settling down of a lot of these people will explain why perhaps this section was given when it did. So stick around for part 3.